As we have been seeing, rhyme can contribute in a wide variety of ways to what an individual poem is saying or doing. It is important we recognise this variety, because whereas it is true that there may well be some general correspondences between the way in which rhyme operates in one poem and the way it operates in another poem, we should never assume rhyme is doing exactly the same things for exactly the same reasons or with exactly the same effects in different poems. Instead, we should remember that rhyme is always a part of a greater whole. It interacts with, shapes, and is in turn shaped by the other elements of the poem, such as metre, genre, but also the poem's themes. Now, because this mixture of things that makes up each and every individual poem will always be to some degree unique, the contribution rhyme makes to that poem, the way it interacts with the other elements of the poem, will always be unique as well. Now, to illustrate this, I'm going to comment briefly on the contribution rhyme makes to three of the poems we've been discussing earlier in this module: Sylvia Plath's Mad Girl's Love Song, Emily Dickinson's I Dwell in Possibility, and R.S. Thomas's Comparisons. Let's start then with rhyme in Sylvia Plath's poem, Mad Girl's Love Song. Now, this is a poem in which the rhyme and the rhyme scheme is very, very prominent. It's very much in your face, or perhaps better, in your ear. You can't escape it. And indeed, one of its functions then is to help us identify that this poem is a particular kind of poem. It's a villanelle. And as we saw elsewhere, villanelles are very rule-bound forms. They have to contain 19 lines, for example. The first line of the poem and the third line of the poem, moreover, have to reoccur at preordained moments in the poem as well. And what's more, they have to adhere to a strict rhyme scheme of A, B, A in the first 5 stanzas, A, B, A in the final stanza. And I've marked this on the screen in colour. So all the words in blue rhyme, all the words in yellow rhyme: dead, head, red, or again, sane, name. Now, you may have noticed that I skipped a few of the rhymes here because actually not all of the rhymes in this poem are exact, and we'll think in a moment about why this might be. But nonetheless, in keeping with most villanelles, what you then get are 2 sounds, just 2 sounds, repeating at the end of every line again and again and again. And this can be used by villanelle writers in a number of ways. Of course, it emphasises this sense of repetition, and this can be used to convey a sense of insistence, or, and this is what I think is going on in this poem, a sense of the speaker's obsession. She cannot stop thinking about this same thing. She cannot escape, as it were, her own thoughts, her own feelings about this man. And one of the ways in which this obsession is really played out dramatically in this poem is through the constant use of the same sounds, or as we'll see, more or less the same sounds at the end of each line. So we've already seen then a couple of functions that the rhyme scheme is performing in this poem. For one thing, it's identifying for those who know what they're listening to that this is a villanelle. And as with poetry in general, if you know what it is you're listening to, this can bring in you certain expectations which the poem can then play with. Does it actually live up to the kinds of things villanelles are about? Does it actually follow all the rules of the villanelle? And so on and so forth. So rhyme is an important part of establishing this broader framework of expectations that we then experience in the particular form in which it's enacted here. So that's the first thing. The rhyme helps identify this as a villanelle. The second thing is that by being quite repetitive, limited, and obsessive, it gives us a stronger sense of the personality who is speaking to us in this poem, for example. So rhyme has a number of general functions here, but do the specific rhymes, the words that actually form the rhymes in this poem, do they have any added meaning from their position as rhyme words, or is their position primarily to support the greater rhyme scheme? This is where we need to be careful, because this tends to be where critics or students overdo their interpretations, trying to find massive significance in everything. And poets generally are a bit more careful than that. If every single rhyme word was heavily freighted with meaning, then this could affect the poem as a whole. It could make it too heavy, for example. But let's just look briefly at the B rhymes. I'm just going to stick with the full rhymes, because as you'll notice, again, does not really rhyme or fully rhyme with in or. Well, perhaps men, but it's again men, it's not exact. So let's just think about the full rhymes. Again, well, this is a poem of repetition, again and again and again. It's interesting that this is the final B rhyme we get as well. Once again, we get the word again. And unlike the A lines, there are no rules that say you have to repeat in the B lines anything that's been said earlier. So this is a specific choice by the poem. And I think this repetition, this echoing of again at the beginning and the end, gives us the sense that this is something that's going around and around and around. What about name? Does this have any significance? Well, perhaps you can find some. For myself, not particularly. I think this is one of those words, of course it's fulfilling the sense of the line that it's in. It's also keeping the rhyme scheme going, but I think the fact it's a rhyme, for me anyway, doesn't contribute much to the poem, which again shows that rhyme can be interpreted in a variety of ways, and it's always connected up with how you interpret the broader poem. Insane, on the other hand, this is clearly a very important word in this poem, because this poem raises the question of, in what sense is the speaker mad? Is she mad with love? Has she been driven mad by love? Or is she mad and the whole thing is just taking place in her head and doesn't have any reality at all? So for me, in contradistinction to, say, name, the rhymes like again, which comes twice, and insane do have an extra weight. But what about these B rhymes that don't quite fit? In and men. Do they have any meaning as words, as rhyme words? Well, I would again say in isolation, it would be hard to make much of either of them. I mean, what does the word in what way does that have any special significance for this poem? You could perhaps say men does if you read this in a very gendered way, but it's not entirely obvious. What I think is interesting about these two lines then is that they show us a different way in which rhyme is playing a function, a variation, if you like, on the basis tune of the rest of the piece. Look at the lines in which they come. And arbitrary blackness gallops in. In itself seems an arbitrary choice. It doesn't really quite fit the rhyme scheme of the villanelle. It suggests that this obsession, it can give a sense of being very, very fixed, but perhaps there is a degree of arbitrariness at work here. So just as there's arbitrariness in the universe she describes, so there is a bit of arbitrariness in the way she expresses herself. You can say something similar, I think, about this full stanza. In fact, I'll come on to the A rhymes in the moment, but they all rhyme: dead, head, red, bed, but not really fade. So here in this stanza we have two lines that ends with sounds that almost rhyme in the way they're supposed to, but don't quite. Well then, what are these lines actually describing? They are describing the universe collapsing. God vanishes. hell disappears, Satan disappears, the whole universe just collapses potentially and becomes empty. Well, you could say that with these not quite rhymes at the end, something similar is going on with the villanelle. The universal rules of the villanelle are likewise in danger here of being toppled over. And we may think, actually, as a general thought, what might this mean for the speaker? She's obviously very much trapped in her thoughts and her feelings in this poem. If this were to just fall apart, would this be a freedom for her? Or would it be a world in which she couldn't survive? So again, here are just 3 rhyme words that I think do have specific meaning, not in and of themselves. In and men are not significant words in this poem, but what they enact as rhymes or half rhymes or near rhymes does have some kind of meaning. So this brings me on to the A rhymes: dead and head, red, bed, and so on. And of course, dead and head are 2 words that keep coming back. So do they have particular significance? Now, it should be said that one of the ways the villanelle is set up is rather like a dance. They actually supposedly come from country dances. And what you get in a villanelle is a sort of dance between these 2 repeated lines. So you get dead and head, just 1 line between them in the opening stanza. Then you only get 1 of them at the end of each stanza, but you still hear the other somehow. They're sort of dancing around each other, orbiting around each other. And then right at the end of the poem, they're brought right next to one another. So at this point, you can feel, you can hear, you can sense their relationship, whether they actually fit together in an interesting way or they're constantly colliding with one another. But is there significance to the words head and dead? Well, I think head is quite easy to justify. This is an obsessive poem that potentially is going on inside her head, and she's trapped inside that. So this gives a sense, I think, this repetition of the word head, 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 makes us wonder about the reality of all of this, but also gives us a sense of someone's head as something that traps us, something we can't quite get outside of or escape. Dead, I think it's a bit more difficult. Is her love dead? Has something in her died? Or do we feel that this adds a more morbid sense to the poem more generally, that actually the thought of death is very much in the speaker's mind? That's a tentative suggestion, because I just want to close my discussion of this particular poem by reiterating this point that we always have to interpret the rhyme in relation to what's going on in the rest of the poem. And there will never be an entirely correct answer to either of these things, but we need to come up with interpretations that somehow match what we want to say about individual formal elements in the poem and what we want to say about the poem as a whole. Moving on to Emily Dickinson's poem, I Dwell in Possibility. This is like Sylvia Plath's poem in the sense that it gestures towards a fairly set poetic genre. Whereas Plath's poem was a villanelle, though, this one is a ballad. Although, as we saw elsewhere, Dickinson does not adhere as closely to the ballad form as Plath does to the villanelle. And we'll build this recognition into our interpretation of the role that rhyme plays in this poem. So just to review very quickly some of the formal features of this poem, the ballad form traditionally has a line of 4 beats followed by a line of 3 beats. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. This flows quite naturally. It conveys a sense of happiness and joy often, and it's associated not just with ballads, but with hymns and nursery rhymes. And we saw elsewhere that Dickinson keeps this structure present in the background, as it were, but constantly plays around with it, constantly disrupts it. If you recite this poem to yourself, you'll notice it doesn't quite, or at least always, adhere to this very clear rhythm. Sometimes it has too many syllables, sometimes too few. And at the same time, she uses these dashes at the end of almost every line as a way of, if not necessarily breaking the all too easy flow of the da-dum, 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 at least bringing its transitions into question. Rather than using this form to meld things readily together, she disrupts the form to question the solidity, if you like, of some of the equations that she appears to draw. And I would say this is a replication of what she's saying about the House of Poetry in this poem, that it's a house of possibility. And this means really two things. It means, in a sense, anything is possible. All kinds of things can be put together in all kinds of different ways. That's partly why she puts together this and other of her poems in a variety of different ways. But perhaps it's also a possibility in the sense that it's not always necessarily a reality. It's something to be striven towards, but not always achieved. Anyhow, after that brief survey or review then, how does rhyme, what kind of part does rhyme play in all of this? Well, I've marked in red here the clearest rhymes in the poem. And you can see that there's one set of rhymes per stanza. Prose, windows, I, sky, this, paradise. But we get quite a bit of variety here. The first stanza, the rhyme words are next to one another in the middle. In the next two stanzas, they appear in the second and the fourth lines. And I think, again, this illustrates this notion that poetry can be put together in different ways to different effects. But they're also quite different kinds of rhymes. In the second stanza, I and sky are full rhymes. They're strong lines, they're clear, and I think it reflects a certain certainty about what is being said in that stanza. The rhymes of the first and third stanza, meanwhile, are much more provisional, much less solid. Think about prose and windows. It rhymes, but whereas the emphasis is on the monosyllabic prose in the first word, the stress in the rhyming word is actually on win. Prose, windows. There's a certain fading. And I think, again, this is rather like the dashes that come after them. There's a sense of provisionality here, of tentativeness. Again, exemplifying this notion that poetry is possible, it's full of possibility in the sense that almost everything can be put together in interesting ways. Prose, windows, who would have thought, what's the relation between them? But also possible in the sense of not necessarily or always fully realised. Do prose and windows really fit together, or is this a kind of aspiration, a desire, something that we try out temporarily and then move on to something else? And I think something similar can then be said about the rhyme in the final stanza. This paradise. It's not really a full rhyme, is it? It's close, but it's not exact. And what is the poem saying at this point? It's saying this activity of poetry can lead you to paradise. But I think, again, the emphasis is on can in what I've just said. It may do, but it may also not do. For some people it will, some of the time. For others it won't, any of the time. So this association of poetry and paradise is a powerful one. It's one the poem wishes to present us with, to get us to think about. But there's also a certain uncertainty or ambiguity about it, emphasised by the dashes. The poem ends not with a full stop, but with a dash, but also by this rhyme that isn't quite a rhyme. Does poetry really chime with, does it really fit with the idea of paradise? So here's another example, I think different from what we saw in Plath, in how a poem's use of rhyme can be interlocking, commenting upon some of the statements it makes as well. So finally we come to R.S. Thomas's poem Comparisons. And in my discussion of the poem elsewhere, I've actually already said pretty much everything that I wish to say about rhyme in this poem. But I'm just going to reiterate some of the key points I would wish to make. Now the first of these is that this is not a poem like Plath's or Dickinson's. It does not belong to a preset genre which has a preset way of organising its lines. It's R.S. Thomas's own construction, as it were. On top of that, it makes only very spare use of rhyme. I've marked on the screen 2 sets of rhymes that I think are important to the poem. The one in red, her, feather, anchor, and the one in green, rested, nest, lest, lest. So rhyme has a different profile in this poem from the other 2, and as a consequence I think it plays a rather different role. Like the others though, its primary purpose, I feel, is to add a degree of drama, to control the pace at which the poem proceeds, the pace and the ambience within which we experience it. Let's then take the rhymes in red to see how it does this. The poem begins, "To all light things I compared her." Now this sets up the project of the poem. He's trying to find something that describes her, or to put it another way, he's trying to find an image that rhymes with her. And as we've seen before, if you read out the whole stanza, it sounds like there's a very clear rhyme here. To all light things I compared her, pause, to a snowflake, a feather. This, though, is not quite what Thomas writes. That would only work if the second line ended with her and the third one began with to, because then it would be as if everything has been resolved. He's trying to find something that chimes with her. Well, feather chimes with her. But by placing this to in the middle, it creates a pause. It keeps those 2 things apart and shows that the comparison is one that's being tried out tentatively rather than one that is already achieved. And then in the rest of the poem, we see him experience the inadequacy of these kinds of comparisons. The lightness of them doesn't really work. As he says in the penultimate stanza, feathers are blown away. And then at the end he comes in with a more surprising image. I have let her ashes down in me like an anchor. And we can distantly still hear her and feather before. He's found something that works. It's something surprising, but also by ending on this rhyme word, we get a sense of something being anchored as well. So this is one more example of how rhyme can enable a poem to enact what it also says. So what about the rhymes in green? Well, as you will remember, this is a moment the speaker's recalling at which the woman he's trying to describe or encapsulate is resting on his arm at a dance. It's a moment of poise, and she wishes to hold that moment. She wants to keep it light because otherwise things might fall apart. And part of the power of the poem is that it enacts out, it plays out how words keep moving on. You cannot really hold them back. A sentence has a certain logic that has to be fulfilled, just as life does. And this moment of poise will collapse. In a sense, the eggs will break, she will die, the snow will be inadequate, the feathers will be inadequate as images. But in using these lines, these rhymes highlighted in green, it's as if the poem is trying to stop this movement, to hold it up. She rested. So this rhyme places emphasis on the important word rest, though we don't know it's a rhyme yet, but it will be made so retrospectively. As a bird on its nest lest. That makes us take our time. It holds us up. The eggs break lest. Again, by recalling lest, nest and rest, it holds us back, and it also comes at the end of the line. So in a way it's moderating, it's modulating and regulating our movement through the poem in a way that replicates the poem's attempt, at this point at least, to hold things back, to stop them going into flux and then melting and blowing away. That's all then I would say about rhyme in this poem, but I hope what you've seen in this video is that there are some correspondences between the ways in which these three poems employ rhymes, but that each of them deployed in ways that are individual to and specific to the poems to which they belong. And this is something we really need to attend to when we try to interpret the role or the contribution that rhyme is making to a poem.